Welcome to today's webinar, CareerWise Colorado Youth Apprenticeship Inspired by Swiss VET, brought to you by NCSL. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Joellen Kralik. Joellen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Colorado Youth Apprenticeship Inspired by Swiss Vocational Education and Training. I'm Joellen Kralik, and I work in NCSL's education program, where I cover career pathways across the continuum of K-12 education and higher education to career. So this webinar is the second in a three-part series diving into Element 3 from NCSL's groundbreaking report, No Time to Lose, How to Build a World-Class Education System State by State. Element 3 is that world-class education systems have a highly effective and intellectually rigorous system of career technical education. The employer-driven Swiss VET system is widely considered to be one of the most effective systems of career technical education in the world. In our first webinar in the series, Drs. Ursula Renaud and Catherine Caves gave us a wonderful primer on the Swiss VET system. So if you missed that webinar, the archived video is available to watch on the NCSL website. Today we are going to learn about a system in Colorado that drew its inspiration from that Swiss VET system. So today we have a very distinct privilege of being joined by Gretchen Morgan. Gretchen Morgan is the president of CareerWise, which is a nonprofit focused on designing and launching a statewide youth apprenticeship system, offering a range of engaging and rigorous career pathways to students ages 16 to 20. Gretchen also does a range of work nationally in support of assessment pilots, career readiness, personalized learning, and innovation in education. Gretchen is also the former Associate Commissioner of Innovation at the Colorado Department of Education. In that role, she led work in the areas of innovation in charter schools, online and blended learning, dropout prevention, adult education, health and wellness, and innovation learning. And then prior to being at CDE, Gretchen worked as a principal, a curriculum and program developer, instructional and leadership coach, and an elementary school teacher. She is the author of Innovative Educators, an Action Plan for Teachers, in which she shows teachers how to adapt existing practices and how to invent new ones that foster a proactive mindset. So we're very lucky to be joined by Gretchen today. She's worked in all corners of the education system, and this webinar is going to provide participants with an in-depth understanding of how and why CareerWise came to be within the Colorado policy context. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Gretchen.
Thanks, and hello everybody. So I'm going to start by giving you some background about kind of why we are doing this and how we got started, and then we'll get into what it looks like. So starting with these two kind of sets of nagging problems that we have in Colorado. One is a workforce problem. You can see on the slide here highlights of this, but we have businesses currently paying as much as $24,000 per employee just to recruit and do the basic bit of onboarding because our job market has become really competitive. We also know that middle skill positions take even longer to fill than other positions in our economy. They're also the positions that are growing the fastest and have been growing the fastest over the last several years in Colorado. And we have this persistent set of job vacancies. And at the same time, if you look at outputs for education system, this is a slide that we refer to at home a lot as the leaky talent pipeline. But this is looking at, from 100 students who start high school as ninth graders, how many of them end up with a post-secondary degree, and that includes, certificates, associates, or bachelor's degrees, that number, and then of those, how many end up in immediate employment. And when you look at these two factors together, you would think we have a problem that maybe should be solved by looking at workforce and education at the same time, because we have people who need skilled, talented workers, and we aren't producing enough of them out of our education system. And that also means there's a whole host of kids who don't have a lot of options and aren't finding their way into middle-class work in Colorado. And that's evident actually in our income gap data. Colorado has a pretty significant income gap, and it's been growing actually over the last decade. One more thing to consider about why this work is important. I don't know how many of you have come across the Gallup Hope Index, but it's a measure that they use to see what someone identifies when they also identify as hopeful for the future. And they've done this survey with millions of people across the world, and they do this consistently with folks in the U.S. and with K-12 and higher ed students in the U.S. as well, and have found that if a person identifies themselves as being hopeful for the future, they also always identify these three things to be true about themselves: that they have some sort of goal that they want to achieve, that they believe that if you work hard you're going to get there, they have some level of self-determination, and they believe that there are multiple pathways to achieve that goal that they are interested in. And I think as we look back, at least in Colorado, but really this is true nationally too, the way we have talked to students about pathways out of high school, we've talked to them about there being only a single path. And as you remember from the previous slide, in Colorado right now only 23% of students are actually successfully taking that path, and that is a path to a degree attainment immediately after high school. And I think when you consider that people who don't see multiple pathways don't identify as hopeful, you start to realize that more than just the data that we're talking about here of workforce gaps and students not being ready for workforce, we also have students who don't have a view of a hopeful adult life leaving post-secondary. And so we are trying to do something about that. And so at CareerWise, we're trying to sort of bridge this gap between education and career by creating a statewide modern youth apprenticeship system, one where we hope everybody really benefits from participating in the system. And I want to just do a little bit of a history lesson here of how we got here, because I think the story of how it began is important. So long before there was a notion of CareerWise, we are not quite 2 years old right now as a nonprofit here in Colorado. So long before then, there have been really important work going on in our state. So going all the way back to School to Work initiative, 20 or more years ago, large investment under Governor Romer, and a lot of effort to try and build up workforce programs inside schools. We had, following that, statewide career pathways alignment groups, which tried to get career industry groups together with schools to talk about which sort of pathways they should be building. We started to see some encouraging data coming out of Denver Public Schools, CTE programming in particular, but really across the state, data that showed that students who participate in CTE of all different backgrounds graduate more often and matriculate into post-secondary more often than their peers who don't. We've had great work led by our Workforce Council on getting sector partnerships going in the state. Colorado is actually known nationally for the work that the State Workforce Council has done, not to derive that, but to facilitate and enable that, so that local communities of businesses get together in their sector and are facilitated in deciding what their shared needs are in a region, and very often they identify workforce as a need. And so when we were trying to get off the ground as CareerWise, we had a number of communities where there have been strong sector partnerships where businesses already had some experience collaborating with one another, and that turns out to be pretty important. Then there was this trip to Switzerland, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Switzerland as we go forward in this discussion. They said at the beginning we are really inspired by the Swiss VET system, and that's true. We find there to be things about the values of that system that really align with Colorado's values, particularly the value of choice and really wanting individual students to be able to make choices. So Denver Public Schools invited our founder, Noel Ginsberg, and the State Workforce Council lead, Stephanie Beck, and some others to go to the Swiss CMETS Institute in the summer of 2015. And this is a 10-day-long institute that Noel planned to only attend for the first few days. And by the end of the third day, he had changed his flight so he could stay for the entire institute, because Noel has a kind of unique background as it relates to these two problems that we began our conversation with. Noel is a business owner. He owns Intertech Plastics, which is an injection mold plastic business here in Denver. And he and his wife have also done quite a bit of work in urban youth development, including things like sponsoring a group of dreamers through the I Have a Dream Foundation. And Noel has seen for a long time that he really has trouble finding talent in some of his middle skill roles. These are high pay jobs with growth and opportunity, and he has trouble finding people. And when he started doing work with urban youth, he realized that there are so many young people that are so capable and have so much potential and don't seem to find their way into those middle skill, middle class careers. So at the Institute, he became inspired because he realized this was something that could be done that would be systemic and ultimately self-sustaining, that could address the problems he had seen, which really mirrored, again, the larger problems that we've seen consistently across the state. So he came home, he talked to the governor. Our governor did what I think governors are often famous for doing, which is to say, what a good idea, Noel. I think you should do something about that. And so he formed the Bell Commission, which is the Business and Experiential Learning Commission. It's the governor's commission. Noel is the co-chair of that commission, along with the head of the Department of Labor and Employment for the state of Colorado. And that is a commission made up of department leads and business leaders with the explicit purpose of trying to better understand and better organize and help people find access to experiential learning and work-based learning experiences across the state. The Bell Commission is interested at about people at all stages of career path, but at CareerWise we're focusing just on youth apprentices in high school. But the Bell Commission was established to kind of support further inquiry about this. And there was enough enthusiasm coming out of that and coming out of some great collaboration going on across the relevant departments at the state here, that the governor actually supported a mission back to Switzerland. This is in January of 2016, where he came along with us for 4 days of a 5-day trip. And we had business leaders, the Bell Commission business leaders, as well as others. We had some members of philanthropy with us. We had the head of the community college system and a community college campus leader. We had a superintendent. We had a couple of other education folks. And we were there together to learn about this system and to try to imagine how might we do something like this in Colorado, understanding that Colorado isn't exactly Switzerland, but understanding that there are some things about their design that, again, really do align with our values. Since that trip, CareerWise was launched in June of 2016, actually, that should say. We did launch as an organization. Sorry, our first apprentices did start June 2017. And a couple of our districts have been able to pass pretty significant mill and bonds to raise money to support expansion of career and technical education, but specifically have garnered some of that support because of their deep investment in youth apprenticeship. So I tell you that whole story because it's kind of how we get to how we got off the ground. And the other part of us making it off the ground successfully was being able to have some policies in place that have made us getting such a system together a little bit easier to do. So we have already concurrent enrollment statute in place here. We have PTEC, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is a business and K-12 partnership that includes kind of an early college aspect for students. We do have early college legislation as well in our state, and a number of early colleges already operating. And then we have the Ascent program, which is really just a more specific kind of early college. One was created before the other, but Ascent is a limited pot of funds that districts can have to expand a student's education into years 13 and 14 for the purposes of earning an associate's degree. And all of those funding structures matter because students in our program are apprentices starting in grade 11, continuing into grade 12, and then a year past normal high school graduation, year 13. These are 3-year apprenticeships. So where there's public funding to help support some of the training for apprentices into a 13th year, that's a great enabler. We also do have some means of permeability. We have the ability to have courses, they're called guaranteed transfer courses at the community college level, be taken at the community college level, and every 4-year public institution in the state must, by law, accept them for the kind of credit that they are. And part of the choice in the Swiss system has to do with when a student chooses apprenticeship, they aren't choosing not to go to university. There's an easy path to go from apprenticeship to university. And we wanted to make sure that that was true in our launch here, and so we're taking advantage of the GT Pathway courses, and every apprentice pathway includes at least 4 of those courses paid for either by the school or the employer, depending on the pathway. And then just a few other things that are happening. We have a competency-based graduation policy, so we don't have seat time policies for graduation, and I think that's another big enabler here. We have a lot of variation in local graduation requirements, and so there may be local policies that include seat time, but at a state level we do not. And part of what students need to be apprentices is flexibility in their schedule in their 11th and 12th grade year. And part of what makes it even better is if they have the ability to demonstrate competency in a wide range of learning contexts and have that be validated for issuing credit back at their high school. So in some of our districts, they have gone really far with competency-based learning and are able to document that learning and use that toward accumulation of graduation requirements. But even in districts where that isn't happening, just that we don't have seat time requirements actually is a really large enabler. And then there is also some really great competency-based work going on in our community college system. And so we see the potential, it's not all the way there yet, to get alignment about career pathways in a competency-based way that businesses have influenced in terms of technical competency and will have some ability to span K-12 and the community college system here. Things we're working on in the future in terms of policy, not yet enablers, is removing seat time from our school funding formula. So even though our graduation policy does not require seat time, our funding formula does, and it's not strictly a problem. Schools that have youth apprentices now are maintaining full funding for their students, but it makes them feel nervous about having strange schedules because their schedules are audited for funding purposes. So that is a thing we would like to make easier in the future. It would be great if there were an apprenticeship-specific Ascent fund because the more we have public investment in training, the lower the cost is for companies to provide training, and therefore that would be, we think, enabling of scaling into perhaps sectors that we aren't in currently. And then the last one is we have a policy called an endorsed diploma, and that diploma policy allows for automatic entrance into four-year institutions based on having met a set of criteria, and we think there's a possibility that we could work to define, again, an apprenticeship-specific definition to make transfer into four-year schools even easier for apprentices if that's what they choose to do. We do have, without that policy change, we do have some negotiated agreements with a couple of campuses to not only give kids some preference coming in if they've come out of an apprenticeship, but also to allow for a much larger proportion of transfer of credits beyond the guaranteed transfer courses. One institution here has already committed to giving credit for the time at work in the apprenticeship because they believe they will be able to validate competencies out of it with a prior learning assessment. So lots happening already there. So just to restate, our partnership here really is a public-private partnership. CareerWise Colorado is a nonprofit sitting in the middle of all of these different entities and between them and business to try and figure out how to get youth apprenticeship off the ground. But I do just want to state, especially given the folks that I know are on the call, we could not have launched here in Colorado at this moment if there wasn't that long history of collaboration among these partners. Our departments have a long history of good collaboration, and some of that was in that timeline that I shared with you. But that really mattered in terms of us being able to establish ourselves as a partner and a collaborator. We had businesses already in the habit of collaborating inside regional sectors, and we had departments with a history of collaborating, and it really did make our work a lot easier. So just popping out here to the Swiss for a second. So we studied all kinds of different youth apprenticeship systems and decided that we wanted to learn from systems that had the outcomes that we most desired, right? And so we looked for places where there was the highest participation in apprenticeships. In Switzerland, about 70% of students actually choose to participate in each graduating cohort from their compulsory school, and then about 30% of them go to baccalaureate, which is essentially pre-college high school. Again, in the end, many kids who start out as apprentices end up in university. They also have universities of applied science that a lot of apprentices go to. That's a little bit different than our four-year programs. But a lot of kids do it. Highest apprenticeship completion rates, Switzerland also is really high there. Kids who start them generally finish. And countries that have low youth unemployment in particular. And we are really lucky that we have low unemployment in general across the state right now. but it is not as low for youth as it is for everybody else, and there are still some subgroups excuse me, of youth who have unemployment rates up over 10%. And so we wanted to look for systems that yielded the outcomes that we most wanted to see here. So we landed on the Swiss. And as I said to you before, we have a pretty significant income inequality actually in Colorado, and in Switzerland as a country, their income equality is significantly less than the United States. They also have a much lower poverty rate than we do. And obviously they're a different country with different demographics and all kinds of things, but they are a country that has had a pretty consistent stream of recent immigrants for a couple of decades now, and their data has not changed all that much in terms of poverty rates and income gaps. And they attribute their youth apprenticeship system as being a major factor toward that outcome, because young people coming into the country can enter that system too and be successful. So that's partly why we were interested in the Swiss. But we didn't try to replicate their exact system. And if you go searching for Swiss VET, you'll pretty quickly find a diagram that shows exactly how their system is laid out, with compulsory education and then the choice to go either into baccalaureate or to go into an apprenticeship, and then all the places a student can go from baccalaureate to university, or from baccalaureate into apprenticeship into applied science, advanced technical study, apprenticeship into university, that all those paths are possible. And that value they really keep under the label of being student-centered. And that's a recent change in their system. I mean, although they've had apprenticeships for hundreds of years in Switzerland really, this change to have a student-centered system that offers that level of permeability to change lanes that you're moving in as you develop in your career is only about 25 or 30 years old for them as a country. The other value that they hold that we have really taken to heart here is to be business-driven, and they mean business-driven in that companies are paying to have apprentices, and they choose when an occupation should become an apprenticeship occupation. They determine the competencies for that occupation. They determine how those competencies will be evaluated to be issued a credential. And they train supervisors across companies and determine which companies are allowed to be training companies for that occupation. That's all done by business through their business associations. The role government plays is just to say, you need to have sufficient businesses participating. You need to have data to show it's a viable pathway for young people who would enter. But as long as an association follows those processes, then the pathway is sort of blessed and made a federal pathway. And the number of positions available in any given year in any particular occupation is all driven by business. They don't post jobs they don't need, again, because it costs them a fair amount of money to have an apprentice. So it is business-driven in all those ways, and we really have tried to replicate that value of being business-driven, and also try to replicate some of the incentives that they have in their system to have everybody participate and have it work with quality. So we are sitting, among these different entities: community, government, the apprentices and their families, businesses, and the desire to have a sustained quality statewide system. And we're trying to sort of figure out what are the parameters that are going to make this sufficiently interesting to everybody that they want to keep doing it. And I'm going to give you just a couple of examples of what this looks like. So we have, for example, in our design parameters that there will be statewide business identified occupational pathways. All of our current pathways were identified that way, and we will only add new pathways when businesses have identified the need for them. This is important to business because it gives them a concrete mechanism that they can use to drive better alignment between their needs and training centers. And all states have mechanisms by which they try to have businesses and community colleges stay aligned. And I would say community colleges try very hard actually to get business participation in those. But businesses are willing to participate with more depth and consistency when they have money on the line themselves. And so in this case, when they have apprentices that they're going to spend maybe $50,000 on over 3 years between wages and training fees that they're going to pay for, they are willing to spend more time talking with training institutions and helping make sure that programming is really aligned to the competencies that they think are really essential for someone being successful in that occupation and in the steps of that pathway to follow that first step. And so for businesses, the fact that this is statewide is helpful because it means other people training in other parts of the state are also going to be aligning to what they need. For companies, it's also really important that there's a 3-year duration to the apprenticeship, because that ensures that they have a positive return on investment, and I'll give some detail on that later. It's also important to the company that they pay wages, and this might seem counterintuitive, but if a company weren't paying an apprentice, the supervisor of that apprentice would not have as strong of an incentive to get them to be highly skilled. And for a company, the more highly skilled an apprentice becomes, the more productive they become, and the more value they have to the company. So actually, the fact that they are paid creates a positive incentive for the company to get them to be highly skilled as fast as possible. Those same design parameters have value to the apprentices, but in really different ways. Right? The fact that it's statewide business identified occupational pathways, also makes it true that for students, their skills be transferable, and that they're not being trained in pathways where there aren't opportunities. The 3-year apprenticeship duration is great because it ensures that they, again, have access to high skill development, and that the employer is going to want and push them to get to high skill development, so they're not going to be fetching coffee for 3 years. And them being paid wages, again, makes it so they have value for being there. We have some students who would be working in any other job while they're in high school, and this is a way for them to bring money to their family while they're here. Some students are doing this saving for college. Some students, I'm sure, are wasting some money on pizza and video games, but we're trying to help them be smart about that and not do that with most of their money. But them being paid, it provides a really different incentive for them than it does for the company. And so we are trying to help negotiate these parameters, again, so that it isn't that businesses have youth apprentices because there's a policy that gives them a big tax incentive to do so. It isn't that students participate because they are told they have to choose one thing or another. It is that businesses choose to participate, students choose to participate, schools choose to make this available to their students because they each find something naturally and selfishly, frankly, appealing about the apprenticeship itself. So now I'm going to shift to what exactly does it look like, right? So if we are negotiating these parameters, what are those parameters right now? And they are that a student starts an apprenticeship again as a junior. It continues for 3 years. So in year 1, they're spending about 3 days a week in school, finishing up normal high school graduation requirements, math classes, and things like that. And about 16 hours a week on the job. Some kids are working 2 full days a week. Some are working those in half days. That's up to the student and to the business to sort out their schedule. Schools let students know what kinds of schedules they can accommodate, and they work that out when they're in the marketplace, which I'll discuss later. And then they're spending some time at a training center. That's almost always right now a community college. And sometimes those courses also meet high school graduation requirements. Often they do. And so there's some efficiency actually in this description of hours, but they are taking those courses, they are finishing up high school requirements, and they are working. When they enter year 2, their work increases a little bit more, their training time increases a little bit more. In year 3, both of those increase significantly because obviously their high school graduation requirements have been completed. Most of our students are just an apprentice in year 3 and not still in high school, but we do have, as I said before, some partners in K-12 who have those funding structures in place to carry a student into that 3rd year. Mostly they would do that if the student wants to be earning a complete associate's degree as well as participating in the apprenticeship. The apprenticeship ensures that they will build like about a year's worth of college credit if they max out on all the courses that are offered to them over the 3 years. If someone wants to be taking more coursework and their school is an early college school, often in year 3 they're staying enrolled to be able to complete more coursework that goes toward their associate's degree. So that's generally what it's looking like. And for students, it means that at the end of that apprenticeship, they have, of course, a high school diploma, but they also have 1 or more professional credentials or certifications. Each of our pathways culminates in 1 or more professionally recognized credentials. that are a meaningful and trusted, as far as businesses are concerned, a trusted way of evaluating a set of competencies associated with the occupation. They will have, as I said, 30 or more debt-free college credits, depending on the choices that they have made based on what is offered. Kids are guaranteed that 4 or more GT pathway courses are part of their pathway, and that employers can spend up to $5,000 a year on additional technical courses. That could get a kid a lot of credit if that's what they're in this for. There's a minimum set of courses required to ensure that they're building the skills of their pathway. They will have accumulated $25,000 or $30,000 of pay over those 3 years. And at the end of it, they can go to work and earn a living wage. We don't have any pathways that don't result in a living wage. We've certainly had some sectors and companies approach us with positions that don't result in living wage work, and we just have said no. We're not including those as pathways here because we aren't doing apprenticeship to build someone to go into a fixed occupation for their whole career. We are doing apprenticeship to build an entry point for young people and talent for companies, but that entry point for young people needs to have growth potential and choices. So that is what it does for kids, which we think means apprentices at the end of their apprenticeship, as compared to other students currently graduating high school, have more choices. And again, this is a big value in the Swiss system that really struck a chord with us when we visited there, was schools should offer students lots of choices and should ensure that all students get a good start on whatever choice they want to make. And so by including GT pathway courses and by ensuring that they end with a living wage, we're making sure that anybody at the end of their apprenticeship could sign on and go right to work if that's what they want to do. They could continue in education and have an easier time financially than they would have had before, and a more efficient time than they would have had before. Or they can do both of those things. They can be working in their occupation, making good money while going to school. And actually we have a lot of apprentices planning to do that. So back to the companies. Why would a company do this if it costs so much money, right? It's, like I said, $40,000 to $50,000 maybe over those 3 years that they're spending between wages and training costs. And this is a model based on data from Swiss companies across a wide range of sectors that shows, if you look at the green curve, that's worker productivity. And not surprisingly, at the beginning of an apprenticeship, when someone is 16 and they're showing up to work as an accounting clerk, they are not amazingly productive because they have not been trained. And so their wage, that orange line, is more than their productivity, right? So companies lose money on apprentices for a little while. And in Switzerland, again, on average, across multiple sectors, across multiple occupations, at about the halfway mark, the productivity equals the cost. And then you have a whole other half of the apprenticeship in which the productivity exceeds the cost. And that balance over time, on average, again, leads to an ROI for the company of 10% over the full training period. So back to the little bubble slides we had earlier in talking about design parameters, that 3-year length of apprenticeship is really important, because if we cut this apprenticeship and made it 2 years long, it's not like the curve would change. It's just we would cut it off sooner, which means the employers would not have an ROI. In fact, they would probably have a loss over the term of the apprenticeship. And again, our goal is to make sure that having apprentices is very attractive to companies for reasons that are entirely selfish. We don't want businesses to do this out of the kindness of their hearts. Our business partners are lovely and they do have kind hearts. But that's not why they're doing this. They're doing this because they have a talent problem, and they find this to be an efficient and cost-effective way to address their talent problem. And that needs to be true, because otherwise when we suddenly have high unemployment and all kinds of people looking for work, companies aren't going to continue to invest in apprentices. And in Switzerland, because there is this model by design, companies continue to hire apprentices in both good and bad times, because they're building up employees for what they know is going to come when things bounce back. And they want to be ready to react to that, but they want to be ready to react in a way that is low cost. And so apprentices make that work for companies. So I thought it'd be good to give you just a little bit of a picture of who are our companies in our first cohort. So just a little timeline reminder. This time last year, our first group of companies, about 40 of them, were posting apprentice jobs. Apprentices were applying for them. Hires were made by the end of last school year. So our first cohort began work either in the summer or fall of 2017. Those 40 companies and 113 apprentices are up and going now, and now we have a second cohort, a total of 60 companies having posted a total of 168 positions in our marketplace that's open right now for the second cohort. But in our first cohort, this is what we found to be common across the companies, and this has continued actually into the second cohort of companies as well. They have some kind of clear human capital pain point that makes doing something weird and risky seem worth it. Maybe they have a position that is just in constant churn. Maybe they have a position where the time to hire is really, really long. Maybe they have a training cost for a position that's very high. Whatever it is, they have a very clear pain point, and it's in a middle skill kind of level position, and they think this is a potential solution. For some of our companies, they have a big retirement cliff coming. Some of them also have not as diverse a set of workers as they do clients. And we have some companies where the second and third bullet are happening at the same time, where they have a whole group of people that are about to retire, and all of them are white men, and they are seeking to diversify the folks who come in and replace them so that their workers, again, better reflect their client base, because they believe that's going to increase the quality of their customer service and engagement with clients. We have companies who believe that growth of a talent pool is going to have long-term benefits in terms of their costs of talent in a very long-term way. We have some people who are looking at this as like a 10-year investment, not just for their company, but sort of for the field of workers in their sector. And then we do also have companies who do care about youth development. As I said, that's not the reason that anyone is doing this. It's not the primary reason. But a lot of our companies are happy to find that they can be part of a human capital strategy that also feels good to be a part of. And many of them have found actually that there are really nice benefits to having youth inside their companies, and not just in terms of feeling good, but also people who maybe forgot that they are really skilled and have things to teach someone find that they are rejuvenated in their own work because they are teaching. So lots of great things happening. So this was in our first year. We had these first 4 pathways: advanced manufacturing, information technology, financial services, and business operations. You can see the specific occupations listed under each of those. So for each of those occupations, we worked with businesses to identify competencies and credentials, then worked with community colleges to identify coursework that aligned and would be supportive of competency development. You can see some of our first companies here on this list and the pathways in which they were hiring apprentices. New for this year, we have launched a healthcare pathway, and the occupation in there is a nurse. It is actually a 4-year apprenticeship, so it goes junior year, senior year, and 2 years past high school, and results in either an LPN or associate's degree in nursing, depending on which training is available in the region and which training plan the employer is willing to support. But it's a really exciting pathway. It took us 2 years to build because healthcare is so, as you all know, carefully regulated, which meant there were just a lot of fine details, I's to dot and T's to cross to make that work. But we now have a handful of employers, I think it's 4 or 5 employers, who've posted positions for apprentices in that nursing pathway. So that's exciting, new this year. So this was first year launch stats, 116 apprentices, 40 employers, 10 different occupation training plans, working in 3 different communities. So this is Front Range, kind of Denver area, but also on the Western Slope in Grand Junction, Northern Colorado, up in Fort Collins. We've added 1 more geography this year, Eagle County, which is up in the mountains, and are working with some additional school partners this year as well. A couple of additional districts and charter schools have joined us for this second cohort this year. So as I said before, our second cohort is actually 60 employers. Many of our employers, I think over 65% of the first cohort of 40 employers have posted for additional apprentices this year, and for the most part, those that did not post for additional apprentices did so because they hired the number they want in the first year, and they plan to just sustain that number. and they may be a very small company. We have some very small companies with like 2 apprentices at a time, and they're just going to keep their 2 all the way through the 3 years and then hire another. But we're really pleased to see that all of our companies are staying with us and staying with their apprentices, and 65% of them are adding to their cohorts already in the 2nd year. And in addition to that, we've added other companies, so we now have a total of 60 partner companies. And in addition to us playing that role of negotiating the design parameters, I just want to point out that we also are providing an awful lot of support. It's not that anyone is doing anything, that they've never done before, but we are asking everybody to do things differently than they've done before. So, obviously companies have, recruited employees before, but to what extent do they understand how to write a job posting that's going to be appealing to a 16-year-old? I will tell you that is maybe not the strong suit of all of our partner companies. We've had to offer some great supports there. We then help them build their on-the-job training plan for apprentices and make sure they understand the importance of aligning work to the competencies and tracking progress toward those competencies over time in our learning management system. We train all the apprentices in a boot camp before they begin, a professionalism boot camp to make them ready for the workplace. That includes general readiness, like the importance of being on time and professional communication, and how familiar are you with Outlook and Excel, to this is who HR is and what you should talk to them about, to how do you go on a business lunch and be comfortable, and what are the sort of norms of those things, all the way down to sector-specific things about the culture of their sector and what they need to know entering to enter with confidence and grace into their sector, as well as career pathway information for their sector. And they get to learn from people who've made their way, who are kind of near peers in their sector. We liaise between the companies and the schools. We don't want companies to have to build the competency themselves of navigating public education. It's not always easy, and so we have a small team of 4 people who act as relationship managers, and they are the people that companies call whenever they have a question or something is going on. And we then reach out to our education partners and work to get information or problem solve or whatever is needed. We train every apprentice supervisor on how to be a good supervisor, and we have a number of companies actually who are using this to train up and try out new supervisors. So we actually have an additional training for if you're a first-time supervisor. And again, a lot of our companies are taking advantage of that to build their own kind of other talent pipeline internally of young leaders. And then we provide all kinds of ongoing supports to them once they are up and going, including continued build-out of training plans, monitoring progress toward those competencies, getting kind of pulse check feedback from apprentices and feeding that back to companies, pulse check feedback from companies, and just really staying in touch with everybody. So not only are we trying to find the parameters for a product that is sufficiently appealing to everyone, but we're trying to help everybody participate with quality. On the school side, it's everything from scheduling support to credit transfer information to transcripting supports, all kinds of things. We also launched last year a process for new communities joining us. We had learned right away through partnership in our first communities that there are some things that make this a lot easier for communities. And the primary one being if there is a well-organized collaborative business community, this is a lot easier to get off the ground. And so when Eagle applied to join us, which they did during the summer and then joined us this fall, the lead applicant on that was Vail Valley Partnerships, which is a regional chamber. And they had done a lot of legwork to work with local businesses and identify that workforce was an issue for them, that this was going to be a solution that felt good to them. They had businesses already committed to be hiring apprentices in the first year. And with all of that in place, it was not very hard for us to support the education community, both K-12 and higher ed, in kind of figuring out what they would need to do. We have not yet met an education partner who's not interested in doing this. It offers some opportunity to students that most educators, recognize that there are, again, 77% or so of their kids who are not going on and achieving post-secondary degree success right now, and that more options would be better. Even if what you want is a 4-year degree, more options and pathways to get there would be better. And so it has never been difficult to get support or interest from the education community. But with the business community leading, it's always been really easy to get that support in place for higher ed and for K-12. And then there does need to be also some just community leadership. And again, communities where there were sector partnerships and evidence of business collaboration, especially with community leadership associated, those have been the easiest communities for us to enter and have things go smoothly. We just had our application round for the next group of communities who will be joining us for 2019. And we had 3 communities apply. We're in the middle of deliberations right now and have said we'll take 1 to 3 of them depending on their readiness, but we're still in the middle of that now. But we have this community readiness framework, which is on our website actually if you want to look at it, that details what does business readiness, education readiness, and community leadership readiness really look like. So that is the end of the deck. There are a few additional slides in here if you want to reference them later, just some greater detail on the design parameters and the different but important value they have for each of the different stakeholders are following this. But that is the end of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Gretchen. We now are going to open up for questioning. So there's a chat box on the left bottom side of the screen, and you can type your questions into the box. And we're going to prioritize questions from the Education Study Group, but everyone should feel free to type in any questions they have. And as we're kind of waiting for those to come through, I have a question of my own. So part of the International Group report was that we advised states to work through messiness and as states are studying and learning from top performers and using those lessons to inform and build a competitive system in their state, that is going to be messy. The process of designing system-wide reform is difficult and it's messy. So do you have any advice for staying the course through that messiness?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, a big driver of everyone's willingness to persist through it, and it certainly, we have had our fair share of messiness for sure, has been, I think that, again, everybody has sufficiently selfish reasons for staying engaged. And I mean selfish in the very best way. I hope you all hear it that way, that, everybody has a real stake in this, and that's causing them to be willing to persist through things that are challenging. And I think the other thing is the disposition of our organization also really matters in that. Our disposition is we are going to figure this out, but only if we listen to everybody and are very transparent, right? So when it's messy, it's never secretive. It is wide open and clear, and everyone is participating. And I think that level of openness and listening and transparency is really essential.
Thank you. So we had some questions pop up in the box specific to funding. Can you provide some insight with that?
Yeah. So initially we are funded by philanthropy, but that will taper off. And we actually have had some really good help from McKinsey to look at if we're charging businesses a fee for our supports, which we are, what would that fee have to be, and at what scale would we become self-sustaining? And we project it's going to take between 10 and 12 years for the fees to sustain us entirely. And the difference between 10 to 12 years has to do with the timing with which other large communities come on in Colorado, because obviously the sustaining is a lot easier at scale, right, because it's a cost per apprentice. So that's how it works. It'll take philanthropy, like significant amounts of philanthropy for 6 years, and then it really tapers pretty significantly after that down to 0 at year 10 or 12, depending.
Great.
And your question about the source of the seed funding, it is almost, it's like 85% private philanthropic dollars. We also have received some public grant funding. There isn't like legislation written to fund us or anything like that, but we've applied for and been awarded some grants through Department of Labor and Department of Defense, actually.
Thank you. And then we have that question that came in from Campbell about what is preventing employers from collaborating without state involvement. So could you provide some insight with that too?
Yeah. So there isn't anything that requires state authority, as in we haven't needed the state to tell anyone to do anything. But having state agencies as partners has been essential, because when we get questions about things like, could a person under age 18 work in our company, it's really important that the Department of Labor has already looked into that question and can answer it for any company in any sector. And again, there are all these other like enabling policies around us here. And I don't want to discount the concurrent enrollment and those other financial school finance policies. I think they're actually really important. But that isn't state driving. That isn't state authority. That's just assets, basically, that exist in our public state system right now. And I would say the reason that businesses don't organize to do this themselves is that it's a lot of work and it's not their core job. You know, a lot of our strategy is making business participation in this as easy as possible. And I think that's required because businesses, generally at least, don't think about human capital in 5- and 10-year ways. They think about it in either like individual person ways or very short-term ways. And this is a more systemic, long-term human capital strategy. So for them to take sort of a risk to invest in a strategy that's sort of fundamentally different than the way they've thought about before, it has to be something where the cost to play is not so high in terms of effort or money that it prevents them from ever getting over the hump and getting started. So I really think anyone trying to get this going in any state will need some entity like ours that helps make it easy for people not only to get over the hump and try, but to participate then with quality.
Great, thank you. And looks like we have one more question there in terms of expansion. Oh, we've got a couple more questions. So we've got a question from Sarah asking, does CareerWise have plans for expansion beyond Colorado? And then we have a question from Representative Santos about enabling policies that I know that you touched on a little bit earlier, but maybe if you could close out answering those two questions, and we'll finish up.
Great. So we don't have any plans of like ourselves going and like trying to replicate anywhere. As I said, we don't think replicating this system was going to work here. We also aren't sure that exact replication of this would work elsewhere. But we do think there are things about our process and the way we have done this. And you know, if another state found that they had similar goals or problems they were trying to fix and believed that this is a strategy that worked, that the process we went through to analyze the assets that already existed and to find the parameters that worked, that process we think can be replicated. And we have a person on our staff, Ashley Carter, she's our Chief Strategy Officer, who fields questions from folks in other states to try and do as much as we can to help answer questions. We also have a free licensing agreement that we're happy to sign with people in other states to share some of our core materials. We have a licensing agreement rather than just posting them online because we think there's enough complexity that if somebody just sort of took them and tried to replicate it, that they could accidentally do some kind of crummy things. So the license agreement ensures that we have sufficient contact with someone and that they are obligated to communicate back with us, but it's free to share. And we also host a couple of site visits a year, and Ashley also helps coordinate participation in those so that other people can begin to learn about this and figure out if it's the kind of venture that they want to take on. And then in terms of enabling policies, yeah, some of them really I think do matter a lot. I think seat time graduation requirements would make this very hard for reasons that are just very practical. Like students need time to do this. And the first few kids that we had drop in the fall, we've only had about 10 kids drop thus far, which actually is much less than we anticipated. And almost all of them, it was that they couldn't manage balancing the time because their school hadn't actually figured out flexibility and schedule well enough at the start, and the glitches in schedule are making it difficult. And I think seat time-based graduation requirements might significantly constrain time in such a way that it becomes just fundamentally impractical. So I think of all the policies, that's probably the most important enabler. I do think the various permeability functions, like guaranteed transfer courses, also are really important, because you would hate to launch a statewide youth apprenticeship system that didn't actually offer choices to students, and without some mechanism for permeability, I think it would not go as well. But different states may have very different mechanisms for permeability. I mean, there's some states where they fund everybody at community college. That would be a great one. We don't happen to have that one, but that would be a great enabler. So that's why I say I don't think it's going to be strict replication anywhere. It's going to have to be careful analysis of which policies in that context can be enablers of a system of youth apprenticeship.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us here today. And that thank you is extended to all of our participants as well. Just to let you know, this webinar will be available to watch on the NCSL website in a few days, so you can share it with your interested colleagues who weren't able to jump on the line today. Also, just right now already, you can download the resource presentation. So if you look at the top of your screen, the black bar at the top, and you see the little phone icon and then the video icon, it's the third one from the left that says Show My Media Library. If you hover over it, you should be able to download the presentation there right now. Other than that, go ahead and stay tuned to the NCSL website for information. We're going to have a third installment of this series of webinars diving into international career and technical education models, and I hope that you all have a great rest of your day and a wonderful weekend. Bye.